Right, so let's get started with the haystack to needle. I'm Matt Tassara, by the way. I'm CTO and co-founder of Defect Dojo Inc. Been doing this Defect Dojo thing for, well, quite some time. So from needle to haystack, and this is talking about eliminating noise and helping you make the data that's inside of Defect Dojo actionable, which is somewhat important. So what's all this then? So I want to define the problem that I'm speaking about today, and that's that I don't care what you call yourself, DevSecOps, AppSec, product security, cybersecurity, whatever you want to call yourself, all the security teams I've ever been on or talked to people that run them, they look nothing like any other team. They're very snowflakey. And quite honestly, particularly in AppSec, if you're writing custom software, you're doing that probably because you really need it, which means you probably have some fairly custom security practices around that custom software. And so this is another snowflakey aspect of AppSec, DevSecOps, whatever you want to call it. And then security is generally seen as a cost center, and it'd be nice if we could turn it into an enabler instead. That certainly makes things better with people north of you on the food chain. And I don't care where you work or in what profession you're in, nobody has a desire to change processes, particularly in the case of AppSec to fit your tools, but in general, people just don't like change. So if you can avoid change, you're doing yourself a favor. So I'm going to talk about how you don't have to do those things. Well, don't have to change anyway. So what's key here? Obviously, what are the goals of your program? That is super important. And once you understand that, I mean, equally important in my mind is how do you demonstrate the value that your program is providing to the company, business, entity, whatever, and particularly to the stakeholders, right? How do you say like, look, not only did you hire me and gave me some budget to do some things, but here's how I'm providing value for it. So half of that battle is sort of gathering the data, but the second half, and probably the more important half, is showing that data to the stakeholders so they understand what you're doing, how you're actually making the company better. So I'm gonna jump back to my previous office hours in case you happen to not be there. So pretend you have that like wavy line screen and the woola 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 sound that you get when you do those flashbacks in 80s TV shows. But in the past one, we talked about the big picture. And the idea here is to have some sort of source of tooling or a source of code or software or what have you. Those feed into a bunch of different tools. Those tools all feed into Defect Dojo. Then Defect Dojo will normalize dedupe and do all the cool things that it does to that data to make it sane. And then you can start talking to downstream systems like Jira, to developers. Maybe you're doing reporting and metrics, maybe you're doing some GRC type activity. But the idea is that you flow a bunch of data into Dojo, it helps you make sense of it, and then the downstream systems benefit. So in the first office hours, we talked about getting data into Dojo. This was the previous one, the one for July. So in this one, we're gonna go right and talk about the downstream stakeholders and how to utilize Defect Dojo's flexible data model and RBAC in particular to help those stakeholders downstream realize the value of your efforts and hopefully show how successful you are being. A couple of things, I'm going to quickly run through these bullet points because I honestly don't have time to talk about them in depth and do the rest of this thing. But some of the smart features that Defect Dojo ships with is the ability to dedupe across tools and within the tool. So if you have multiple scanners, you can dedupe between them, or if you have the same scanner, you can dedupe findings within that tool. We can do auto triage, which automatically closes fixed vulnerabilities. There's the ability to auto assign for infrastructure scans, findings to the correct product, that product and findings being Dojo speak. The ability to keep track of false positives and keep them from reappearing. So you mark a false positive once, Dojo remembers that, you don't have to deal with it in future. All these things help enrich and make that data more useful to downstream stakeholders, and Dojo does that for you so you don't have to mess with it. And then we're going to talk today primarily about the flexible data model. And because we're going to talk about the flexible data model, I want to show it and talk about it briefly. So this is the data model. Starts with the product type, product engagement tests, findings and endpoints. I'm going to go through a fictitious example here in a minute, but for this talk in particular, it's really the first three pieces of that data model, which is where you make some interesting decisions. Product type, product, and engagement. There's some, depending on how you do security, there's things you want to do with those first three parts of the data model. And that's what we're primarily going to talk about. But to run through the data model, so product type is, I like to think of it as a way to collect, primarily for reporting purposes, data from multiple products. Usually this is a business division, it can be a geolocation, it could be a product family, it could be a product line, teams, if that's how you divide up things. For our fictitious example, let's just use Office. We'll say that's Office. And then in that Office world, a product would be Word, right? That's a piece of the Office suite. An engagement is a way to collect one or more tests together and be able to report on it. So fictitiously, let's just say it's a PCI assessment, right? There's a whole bunch of ways to do engagements that I wish I had time, but I don't have time in this talk. Test is just a activity to discover the state of security of something. Usually this is a scanner, but this can also be a manual activity like a pen test or a threat model. So it doesn't have to be a scanner, generally is, but Dojo doesn't really care. Finding is the vulnerability that was found in whatever that activity was. And an endpoint is where that finding was found, if it makes sense, right? If it's like an infrastructure scan, this could be a host or something like that. One last thing before we get into the meat of it. I'm going to talk about the data model. One really nice thing, all throughout that entire data model, Defect Dojo supports tags. So if there is some last mile piece of configuration you can't quite get with the data model, tags are usually the way to bridge that gap. So keep that in the back of your head as we're talking through these scenarios. So I've got 4 pseudo case studies that we're going to run through. As it says on screen, names have been changed to protect the innocent. These are kind of it's kind of a, I can't speak. It's kind of a gathering, I can say that word, a gathering of experiences I've had either doing trainings on Defect Dojo, personal experiences running a bunch of different product or AppSec teams, but just different scenarios to help you understand the data model in a bunch of different contexts. So the idea here is we're going to cover those 4, explain what the world looks like to that particular fictitious case study, and then break it up into pieces, particularly in a Defect Dojo way, so you can understand how to divide up your data, you know, as you may match pieces or directly one of these case studies I'm going to walk through. So first one, Big Corp, obviously fictitious name. This is a multinational large enterprise that has decided to adopt Defect Dojo. So what's the background on Big Corp? They're a large enterprise. They have a multinational footprint. They have a whole bunch of different areas that they do business in. In terms of the company structure, there's a CISO with the centralized IT that includes AppSec. The key concerns, particularly in a security domain for this Big Corp, is they want consistency of testing across business units. They want to sort of have an even or a sane yardstick to measure across all the different business units so they can judge them appropriately. Larger companies, this should be no surprise to anybody who's worked there. They're generally pretty big on policy enforcement and compliance requirements, right? Another part of that standardization that helps make a company of that size sane. And then FedRAMP, they have one particular business unit that has FedRAMP, so they have a special need for even more reporting and compliance activities. If you've never dealt with FedRAMP, there's a whole lot of compliance and reporting requirements for FedRAMP above and beyond sort of normal business operations. So what does security look like at Big Corp? So as I mentioned earlier, it's highly centralized. They have some functions delegated out to BISOs, or Business Information Security Officers. It's sort of like a little CISO for a business unit. Because they're so big, they need to have sort of a control point, that BISO, within the business unit that takes direction from the CISO, the centralized group. The goals for them, they want to avoid regulatory and compliance issues because for them, that's a big yardstick in which they measure themselves, and they want to maintain a high standard of testing, right? There's no surprise there. Key stakeholders in Big Corp, obviously the CISO and the BISOs, very important. Product owners, the people who own the products within those business units, and compliance and audit teams, right? Because at the end of the day, the security team likely has to demonstrate to compliance and audit internal teams, hey, we are meeting those requirements. Here's my evidence that shows that. So what does testing look like at Big Corp? They have a mature program. It's very well documented. Now there's a bunch of interesting aspects of this well-documented mature program in that it's had a lot of different leadership focuses over time. So it is well-documented, it's mature, but there are certain areas that have gotten more or less love over time based on who was running the show primarily as a CISO, or at least whoever that was doing AppSec for that CISO. What do they do for internal? They do CI/CD, SAST, SCA, and secret scanning. They do threat modeling and DAST as well. And then for external, they have third-party pen tests, external audit and compliance audit, external audits and compliance audits as well. All that is kind of their landscape of testing. So how does Big Corp do their data model? Well, this shouldn't be too surprising. This is kind of a very standard thing. Product type is going to be a business unit because that makes sense. In this case, their business units include consumer electronics, a consumer goods department, power generation, insurance, and they have that one sort of oddball FedRAMP business unit. So why do it by business units? Why make that the product type? Well, in this case, the BISO wants an overview of their business unit, right? That's just kind of, they need that. They're in charge of that. The CISO wants an overview of their direct reports, which are BISOs, which map nicely to a product type. And then FedRAMP is its own kind of product type because it has enhanced reporting and a whole bunch of other additional activities that you have to do to meet that FedRAMP standard. So that's its own unit because it's sort of a special snowflake amongst the different business units of this fictitious corporation. So I've set the stage, hopefully. For product, how are they going to do product type? Well, those are just going to be products within a business unit, right? So for example, for power generation, that business unit might have a smart meter platform, a grid maintenance tracker, a centralized meter billing products that they sell as part of that business unit. So why make it business units? Well, business units are broken into product groups which have a product owner. So it makes it really easy to take the security assessments or the net of the security assessments for that product and report it to that product owner via the products being their own thing in Defect Dojo in the data model. And then BISOs want to understand their, in essence, direct reports, their products and what they look like, because if they need to, let's be nice and say, pay special attention to one, they have the ability to see that standout one either overperforming or underperforming and take appropriate action. And then RBAC at Big Corp, how do they want to divide up access to Defect Dojo? So in this fictitious example, the security team owns Defect Dojo, and that security team are the admins of the platform. So they sort of have the admin, the owner accounts. Read-only logins, they're going to give read-only logins to product owners, which allow them to request via peer reviews things like, this specific finding should be a high instead of a low. I need a risk acceptance. They can actually make requests of changes to be done by the centralized security team. And then read only for BISO analysts for each business unit. This is so that they can gather metrics they need and provide reporting for that particular business unit. And there's no logins in this particular instance for dev team members. They're pushing findings to Jira, and that's where their dev teams live. And so that's where they see the output of the security team in terms of vulnerabilities that were discovered. So what does this look like from a data model graphical perspective. So we have this power generation as a product type. Within that product is the smart meter platform. They're going to have an engagement for CI/CD runs. Every CI/CD run has a SAST, SCA, and secret scanning. For the smart meter platform, they're doing threat modeling, and they've got a threat model session as a test. And then they've got a Q2 2024 pen test, which is that third-party pen test. Now for centralized meter billing, they're doing the same CI/CD runs and the threat modeling and the third-party pen test, but in their case, they're also doing a pre-PCI assessment, right? In this case, they're doing billing. There's PCI component to this. So they're doing infrastructure scanning ahead of doing their PCI assessment to make sure that they've got their ducks in a row before they get audited. And then they'll do a Q3 PCI assessment. So one of the nice things about the way the data model works in Defect Dojo is, even though you have this consistency of product type and product, within an engagement, you can choose how much sort of care and feeding or security assessment each product requires, and there's no reason to keep them the same if there's different requirements across products, right? Another example of the flexibility.
Hey, Matt, before
Yes.
you go on, we did have a question about the
Yes.
RBAC. So will Defect Dojo support RBAC rights assignment to include tags? For example, any finding with a specific tag can be viewed by the remediation team, like associated with that, regardless of the product type or product.
Oh, interesting. It currently does not support that, but that is a very interesting idea. We don't have RBAC down to the finding level currently. RBAC stops at product type. To do that, you would have to be able to, you'd have to be okay with RBAC rights being assigned to the product level for that finding that got tagged. So if you were to tag a finding with whatever, assessment or what was it, the remediation team 2, you'd have to be okay with that. Whoever is the members of team 2 being assigned RBAC into that product, right? Which I presume you would be. And there is a feature we're currently working on for Pro called Rules Engine that allows you to write rules to say if this condition, it's launching initially with findings in particular. So if this condition exists with findings, like in your example, if this tag exists for findings, take an action. And one of those actions could be put this user in this particular group that would give them RBAC. So it's oh, interesting. Follow-on question. As long as they can only see items tagged XXX. So the way Defect Dojo works today with RBAC, it doesn't go that far down the model. So you would have to open it up at a product level. The other thing, we had a customer that was a financial that had a similar situation. And what they were doing was moving findings out of a triage area into a separate area for the remediation teams. So you could use Rules Engine to move those findings out of the sort of parent product into a product just for that remediation team. In their case, they had an OS team and an app team. And so OS related findings would go to the remediation queue basically of the OS team, and app findings would go to the remediation queue of the app teams. Hope that helps. So it's doable, but you either have to move findings or today you have to move findings or do RBAC at the product level. Will that break relationship with the test that found the issue? So it depends on how you do it. The way that the company that I'm speaking of did it is they were copying the finding and using the parent as a canonical one. However, you could do it if you moved the finding, it would break that relationship, yes. These are great questions, by the way, thank you, because as much as I love talking to my monitor, it's much nicer talking to humans. Sure, glad to help. Okay, so our next fictitious company is the cyber robotics company. They obviously create robots, hopefully that look a little less interesting than the one on the screen. Oops. So they're a robotics company. In this case, they field assembly line robots that have embedded software. So they're making robots. Obviously, there's software that control these robots, and that's their sort of line of work. They have a chief product officer that oversees product and cybersecurity. And for cyber robotics, their key concerns are visibility into which customers need updates, because they can field versions of these robots that may differ between, I don't know, company one, customer one and customer two. Safety, obviously key with robotics, and security of the fielded versions of the robots is key to them. And then they have an R&D department at Cyber Robotics that they're very concerned about. Oh my goodness. Delivery mid-talk. They're very concerned about R&D and security of that R&D unit, particularly for IP theft. So for security at Cyber Robotics, they're focused on a small number of products. They don't have a really broad product line, but the complexity for them comes with the fact that they're fielding multiple versions. So not only do they have, the whatever robot one, they have to worry about the versions that are fielded across customers. So their goals are to ensure that all those fielded robots have the latest updates to address security issues. Key stakeholders in this case: Chief Product Officer, the robot product line owners, the people who own the different product lines that produce the robots, and then customers with deployed robots in their factories. This is really around support personnel, because if there is an issue in a particular version of a fielded robot, I've got to send humans out to that factory to go patch those things. So knowing which versions are fielded and which versions have vulnerabilities are crucial, right? So you're not sending bodies out to update software of robots unnecessarily, because that is not a free activity. And then testing. In this case, there's a strong focus on pre-deployment testing because they have embedded software, and obviously like fixing things before you ship them to customers is very important to cyber robotics. And there's also obviously the downstream cost of, if you don't catch something pre-deployment, I'm sending out humans to go do factory updates, which besides the cost of just sending those people out includes the cost of downtime potentially of that machine at a factory, which isn't a great way to make your customers happy. Okay, so for cyber robotics testing, they're doing CI/CD, SAST, and SCA, and they're doing what they call a security controls review. So each robot has a series of controls that have to be implemented in software, and this is sort of a manual check between the dev teams and an internal auditor to make sure that those controls were actually implemented in the software. And then third-party assessments, in this case for cyber robotics, is they do third-party code reviews to get a second opinion on their source code before it goes live. And for some of their models, they need an external safety attestation, right, to make sure this has the whatever OSHA-approved equivalent for robotics. So for cyber robotics, for product type, for them, they're going to do that robot product line. And then they're going to have an additional product type just for the R&D department. That's right. They need to understand what happens at the product line level, but also they want to make sure that that R&D department has special attention in terms of the concerns about IP theft. So example products would be a robotic welder, an HVLP, high volume, low pressure paint robot, an assembly robot, those kind of things. And then why pick the robot product line as a product type? Well, the chief product officer wants to understand how each product is doing. And the chief product officer wants to make sure that R&D is hardened probably significantly more than the rest of the company. And then they need a high level summary of how each robotic product line is doing overall. Like, is this product generally secure across versions or not, which is what you would get by putting it at the product type level. And then they're going to use, in their case for product, they're actually going to use fielded versions of the robots. So as they deploy a version of the robot, so version 1.6.8, once that gets sold and fielded to a particular customer, that becomes a product because they have to track it at the fielded versions, not the product line level. So this is a very different model from our previous one because you can have multiple versions out there that you have to keep track of. And support personnel in particular need to know which versions have issues so they can take that version number back to their customer database and find out who they got to go send people and trucks out to patch or update that software. RBAC at Cyber Robotics. Chief Product Officer owns Dojo. The product security team are the platform admins. The product line owners have right access to Defect Dojo in this case. They're doing risk acceptances if needed at that level. And then read-only login for support personnel so they can dig into the product type that they support, right? The robot, like the HLPV painting robot, support personnel for that can dig into that product line and see if there are issues with fielded versions. And then the chief product officer has an analyst that goes in and does metrics. So at Cyber Robotics, we have that one special product type for the R&D department where they're doing network infrastructure scans to make sure that they have the hardening that they need to hopefully avoid any kind of IP theft. And then the other product types are the actual robots. So this is the HLPV paint robot. And here's HPR version 168 and 174 and 203. And these do the same tests. So we have the CICD doing an SCA and linter. Pre-release scan is for SAST. They're doing an external code review with a third party, security control review, which is an internal meeting. And then in this case, they had a safety attestation for this first launch version of the robot, and then subsequent testing for the different versions as they've rolled off. Okay, Kate's Cloud Services. So this is a modern software company with Kubernetes, or K8S. You may figure out where I got the Kate's from. Microservices and more. So like I said, they embrace the whole CNCF thing. They're doing Kubernetes, microservices, the whole modern architecture. They have a VP of cloud that oversees all of cloud product security teams, or the cloud product security team. And for them, their key concerns are avoiding security issues, especially ones that cross tenant, right? If you cross a tenant and customer one can attack customer two, very bad for a cloud provider. The ability of the security program to be flexible and rapidly change, because cloud services companies change rapidly, if nothing else, in their products that they offer and the features that those products have. If anyone's interacted with any cloud company, you realize those things shift all the time. And then governance, right, for shared services, because inevitably in a complex system like a cloud service provider, you're going to have some shared services that need special governance. So security at Kate's Cloud Services, they're focused on automation, right? They have a fast-growing, fast-changing team, and they don't have the time to do a lot of manual testing, so they're focused almost entirely on automation. They assign issues to a product tech lead, and that tech lead is responsible for triaging within their product line who gets to fix it, because the assumption is that the tech lead understands the landscape of that product team, which is likely composed of multiple teams, to understand who actually owns fixing that problem. The goals, obviously, to get maximum coverage via automation and minimal human interaction, because they're moving at a high velocity. And then the key stakeholders, obviously the CISO, the VP of cloud, and then the cloud offering tech leads, because they need to understand what things their cloud offerings are responsible for fixing. So testing, if they can't automate a test, they're unlikely to do it, honestly, unless it's required by some kind of outside compliance effort like an annual pen test. Otherwise, it's automated or it doesn't happen at Kate's. So for CI/CD, they're doing SAST, SCA, secret scanning. They're doing DAST via infrastructure as code. They have container and Kubernetes scanning, and they're automatically scanning their image and artifact registry. All automation. And then for external assessments, it's only that annual third-party pen test. So how do you model this? With the data model of Defect Dojo, in their case, their cloud offering is going to be the product type. So compute, cloud storage, database as a service, load balancers, etc. become the product types. Because why? Well, the CISO needs to understand how their different cloud offerings are doing from a security perspective. The VP of cloud also needs to understand how their direct reports are doing. And the cloud, whatever cloud offering, like the compute tech lead, needs to know what problems they own for their cloud areas, right? So the cloud storage tech lead needs to know that these are the problems for the cloud storage overall team or product offering, because usually it's a team of teams. And then product in this case is going to be whatever portions make up that cloud offering, because when you do stuff at cloud scale, it's usually multiple teams doing pieces. If you're doing microservices, it could be lots of pieces that make up what is to a customer a single offering. So for compute, you could have the web console, the API that powers that web console, an iOS app, an Android app, a bunch of different backend services with queues and workers, etc., all composing what becomes a compute cloud offering. So even though for customers may think of I'm using compute at Kate's cloud services, it's really not a thing. It's a bunch of pieces that make up that offering. And then the cloud offering tech lead can manage that at a team level. Like if when an issue comes in, they triage it. Oh, it's in the web console. I'm going to hand this off to the web console team. RBAC there, in their case, the VP of Cloud owns the Defect Dojo, and the cloud product security team are the admins. Maintainer logins, which is a fairly high privilege level in Defect Dojo, is given to the tech leads because they're triaging findings and having to assign them to various products that they own. And so that's at the product type level. Developers are given product specific writer logins so they can do risk acceptances within the product that they work on. And then the VP of Cloud has some analysts that log in read only to pull metrics. So what does this look like from a graphical perspective, I guess? So here's your compute product type. In the case of the web console, which is an SPA, there's CI/CD, which is running the SAST, SCA, and secret scanning. They're doing what they call a deployment review, which is firing up dynamic infrastructure and running a DAS scan against it. They're doing what they call a container review, which is looking at the container images, linting that Docker file, and scanning the artifact registry. They do a K8s review, which is a Kubernetes scan, and then they have an annual pen test. For the iOS app, there's really only CI/CD. There's not a deployment review or those other things. API for console would have the same sort of list as the web console SPA, because it's something they own versus something they're launching into a marketplace like the iOS app. So in this case, there's some special things that Kate's needs to do. So they have shared microservices, like I mentioned earlier. They created a product type just for their shared microservices. This allows them to have this common infrastructure in one product type because there's a team that runs their shared microservices, and then they utilize tags to denote what offerings actually rely on that customer, on that shared service. So if there's like a customer lookup service that likely every offering uses, that would be tagged with every offering so that I knew that if there's a problem in the customer lookup service, the scope of its impact is across all of the product lines versus maybe one that is only used by one or two product offerings. And then because of the churn that happens within this cloud services company, the tech leads are changing frequently. And so managing putting a name in Dojo for all of the different places becomes difficult because today it was John, tomorrow it's Sally, and 3 weeks from now it's Paul. How do I manage this? Well, instead of hard coding names, they just use tags to designate team leaders of particular cloud offerings. And then they just keep a mapping that maps that external, it maps externally that lead to that tag so they can dynamically find that out at the time that they're pulling a report. And then finally, SASE software company. So they're a SaaS company that grew by a bunch of acquisitions. It's a company started with a single SaaS product. That grew and was successful. Then they kept buying other SaaS offerings to sort of grow their stable of things that they could sell. There's a director of quality engineering that in this case oversees the AppSec program. For a SaaS software company, their key concerns, they want to avoid any kind of very public security issues and obviously maintaining compliance. Things like SOC 2, et cetera, that PCI, all those things that allow them to more easily sell a SaaS service and not be spooky because it's not something that a company maybe generally directly controls. They want flexibility of tooling because, to be honest with you, they're growing by acquisition. So even though the initial company may have been a .NET stack driven company, they may acquire a Java company or a Go or a Python company, and suddenly all of the tooling changes. So they need to have great flexibility in the tools they support because they don't know what they're getting the next time they have an acquisition. And then for them in particular, they really focus on main and feature branches, where main represents the current deployed version of that SaaS service, the main branch. And then feature branches represent future versions of that deployed service. So for them, understanding the difference between what is currently deployed, aka the main branch, and what is going to be deployed, these feature branches, is crucial. So security at SASE, they're focused on, like I said, customer impacting security issues because that directly affects their bottom line. And they have these compliance requirements that generally are used to address any kind of vendor management issues they have when acquiring customers. So their goals are ensure that security issues don't negatively impact customer confidence, right? When you're selling SaaS, there's a significant amount of trust you're providing in that you're giving to that provider. They don't want anything that negatively impacts that. Key stakeholders, the CISO, and obviously the Director of Quality Engineering. There are product owners for each of these SaaS acquisitions that have come about. And then the go-to-market and compliance teams play a key role because that's what helps them continue to sell more SaaS offering to more customers. Testing, they focused on large categories rather than having standardized tools because, like I said, with acquisitions, they have no idea what they're inheriting when they buy the next something. They have, though, focused on that feature and main branch concept across all of the product teams. So for internal assessments, it's CI/CD, and it's very mixed depending on what acquisition we're talking about. They do container scans, and some of the inherited acquisitions do threat modeling. And then for external assessments, they do third-party annual pen tests, and they have various compliance requirements. In this case, the product line is going to be the product type. So this is their initial product, which was desktop backup and restore. They have mobile, they have an online photo album, and a to-dos online app. Why? CISO and the Director of QE needs to understand what those product lines are doing. The product lines basically map to acquisitions, right? So they can also map to the process of that inherited org. And the brand is singular, global in Dojo view, but the features are unique to the inner orgs, which are those SaaS products that they've glued together to make their one big SaaS offering. And then product in this case are the pieces or the components that make up a product line. So for the desktop backup and restore, there's a front end, there's a back end API, there's a file streaming service, there's a storage service. So why break it up this way? Well, it's pretty easy because they're acquiring these different SaaS product lines. There's multiple teams within them that make up that actual SaaS acquisition. So it makes sense to make each of those individual teams a product underneath that product type. This works for monoliths, which in this case, the to-do online was actually one big monolith. It also works for modern tech stacks that have a bunch of different services that compose a single kind of functional product. And then it's easy to map that repo or team to a product in Defect Dojo in this case. For RBAC, the Director of Quality Engineering owns Dojo, the AppSec team are the admins. For them, product owners have a product type level access to do risk acceptances and look at metrics, and then read only for developers, which can request peer reviews, which are adjustments to findings. And then quality engineering analysts go in and look at globally read-only access for metrics and reporting purposes. So what does this look like? Here's your backup and restore SaaS offering, the original. They might have a product of backend. They have an engagement for the main branch, which has a series of tests run against it, the CI/CD, SCA, manual code review, threat models, etc. And then for each feature branches, they're going to do testing as well. And they can have as many of these as they need. So special notes for SASE software, because they have this feature branches, things get kind of interesting because they need to report what the current state of the SaaS is, which is the main branch, versus future states, which are those feature branches, or maybe even a hotfix branch. So how do you do this? So Defect Dojo supports the idea of doing deduplication at the engagement level, right? And so because the engagements handle the different branches, that's where I do deduplication. It keeps finding a finding that, say, is fixed in the main branch from duping with a finding that may still exist in a feature branch, or vice versa, because the reporting, those have to be viewed separately, and we want those isolated. What this looks like from a graphical perspective. So for non-repo assessments, they can dedupe at the product level because that's okay. It doesn't really matter. They're not worried about branching. But for main and feature branches, they dedupe at the engagement level because this is where they need to segregate those findings and make sure feature branch 1 finding doesn't dupe with the feature branch 2 finding, because both of those are future realities that haven't made it out the door yet. This is an alternate view of it. Same thing, just viewed in with that the chart. And then this is another group that's right out of our documentation, just shows the scope. So the scope of deduping at the engagement level is just the engagement versus the entire product. Whew, okay, so what does all this get us in terms of stakeholder visibility? Like, what was all this discussion of data model and how to separate things and the flexibility of Dojo by you? So Pro has a feature of dashboard tiles. This is a global view of those dashboard tiles. You can set these tiles to be whatever you want, to show you metrics of things that are important to your particular company. I want you to pay special attention to this bottom line where we have 18, 8, 974, and 8. Right? This is what it looks like if I log in with a globally RBAC owner level person. If I log in with an RBAC of a limited person, suddenly all these tiles update. I have 16, 0, 22, and 1. So every person who logs in with RBAC sees a different view of the important findings or the important issues or the important metrics of that company based on what they can see in Dojo. That same thing exists for our global charts. Here's a global view. March looks pretty inconsequential based on the other months. However, if I log in with a limited user, suddenly March is very important for that particular person's view of what's in Defect Dojo. Defect Dojo supports this idea of grading products. So we have the top 10 and the bottom 10 products inside of Defect Dojo. So if I log in globally, I get a pretty good view of those top 10 products on both sides of the fence. However, if I log in with limited RBAC, I'm only seeing the 2 products that I have access to. In this case, Budget and the internal CRM app. So that's one of the advantages, that you can have the self-service nature of the metrics inside of Defect Dojo just by setting up RBAC. And this works for our metrics and dashboards as well. So this is program insights globally. This is what the world looks like. For my RBAC user, this is what their world looks like. Same thing for the remediation insights. Here's globally, we have 431 open critical and high findings. For that particular restricted RBAC user, there's only 16. So 2 very different views of the world based on the scope of what that person needs to see in Defect Dojo. So key takeaways. Hopefully you are still alive and running with me. So Defect Dojo flexible model is, I think, one of its key super fantastic features, because you don't need to adapt what you're doing in your team to Defect Dojo. You just map it into the structure that Defect Dojo gives you, right? And if you do that mapping, you suddenly get stakeholder reporting that maps beautifully to how you do things rather than having to force everybody to think in a dojo sort of way. And if you combine the data model with RBAC, suddenly you can have stakeholders self-serve, right? You can allow as much access to Dojo as makes sense for whatever your organizational culture is. Some of our customers, everybody logs in. Some of our customers, only security logs in. Whatever it is, you can do that. And the dashboards adapt to the RBAC of that user, giving them self-serve metrics. And then you take data model and reporting and visualization, and suddenly you have a great way to keep stakeholders informed. You can demonstrate the value of your security teams with things like mean time to remediation of findings, as well as trend analysis to show that hopefully your program is moving in the right direction. Whew, and that's it. I'm going to take a drink of water and answer any questions people may have.
Feel free either ask questions about the presentation. I know there's a lot of data there, or if you have any other Dojo questions that came to mind, you may ask those as well.
Yeah, I know a little about Dojo. I'm happy to answer anything.
All right. I think you stunned them, all of that.
I think I buried them in content. Hopefully they're still alive.
Oh, wait, we have one.
Oh, we have a question. Where does the concept of a component fit into the model? Okay, great question. An interesting choice of wording. So in Defect Dojo, there is the idea of a component built into Defect Dojo, which is a library that has been reported vulnerable to the system. So third-party library, kind of think of like SCA type tooling. So inside of Dojo, you can look at the components, which are those libraries that are vulnerable. So if you want to do SCA-like activity, we can get that both at a product level or a product type level or at the global level to understand where vulnerabilities exist at a third-party library level is where components are in Dojo speak. Does that help? I want to make sure components, let's see. How do I create new components? So you don't actually have to create them. When you import tooling that reports vulnerable libraries, Defect Dojo will automatically create those component lists for you. So there's really nothing for you to do. It just happens as a matter of importing tools that happen to report vulnerable libraries. Let's see, question. If after seeing this, we realize we need to change our data model to better fit our Dojo to our org, what suggestions would you make to updating the model to get better reporting? Can we create new product types? Oh yeah, this is a great question. Can we create new product types, move products, or move engagements? So yes. Defect, this is one of the nice things about Defect Dojo is, and this is a great little, just a hint to people who are playing around with Defect Dojo. What I like to tell people is, well, one thing first, you can move products from different product types. You can create new product types. You can move products out of one product type into another product type. So the model's super flexible, not only in how you lay it out initially, but how you adjust it over time. So if suddenly pieces of a product line got moved to a different product line, you could just move those products from product type 1 to product type 2, and Dojo doesn't care. So there's super flexibility there. The other nice thing is Defect Dojo has what's called a cascading deletion model. So if you delete at the product type level, all of the child elements are also deleted, which means if you want a sandbox to play around, create a product type called sandbox and experiment with what you think your data model should be. And when you're done with that experiment, if it doesn't work, or even if it does work, you can just delete that product type and all of that experimentation goes poof. That's honestly what we do when we're doing QE automation. We'll create a product type, we'll do all our testing inside of that product type, then we'll delete that product type, and we've cleaned up after ourselves. So that's a great bit of flexibility of Dojo after you've already set up the system. You're not stuck with that model. It can adjust over time. Super question. Thank you for that. Because I probably should have had a slide on that.
Hey, any other questions? I think then we can wrap it up. We will provide you with the slides and the recording of the session once we get that back. And again, thank you for attending. And you can always, if you have topics that you're interested in, you can always write to Matt or myself, Matt at defectdojo.com or Dawn at defectdojo.com with any ideas or things you want to hear about. So thank you. And it's Wednesday, so we're almost to the long weekend. So have a great long weekend, everybody.
Take care.